got a crazy idea.
Do I?
Why don't you tell me yours?
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Road trip? Road trip. Road trip. Get in. So where are we going?
Somewhere new.
Somewhere far.
Somewhere amazing.
Wonderful.
What the trip changes us.
Well then. Mission accomplished.
And what if things...
Stay the same.
Well, in that case...
Just enjoy the ride.
Is this about the destination?
Well, yes, but
It's also about the journey.
it does make sense.
The bags are already packed.
Buckle up.
All right, good morning. How we doing today? All right. Hey, wanted to let you know this is week 3 of the road trip series, and so next week is going to be week 4, will be the final week, and then on August 10th, we're going to be moving back to 3 services. So take note, the service times changed a little bit. We're going to start a new series, so put a reminder in your phone. You know, if you come to the 11:30 service and get here at like 12:15 usually, look, we have accommodated you. So we're going to be doing that. That's probably going to be the best laugh I get today. Thank you. And so we are in the road trip series, week 3. Last week we talked about suffering. It was great. And so this week my thought was, okay, we're talking about the road to Emmaus. There's going to be a lot of good stuff in here. This has got to be great. And as I studied, I realized that we're going to be talking about disappointment and disillusionment with God. So I drew a second short straw through this summer series. So I figured I at least owed you a joke. And look, if this doesn't work, I'm just going to cut it out next service. So we'll start a little fun. There was a man, he was stranded alone on a deserted island for years. And one day a boat was passing by and saw him there by himself, and so they got on there and they rescued him. And as the rescuers got on the island to help him get on the boat, they noticed 3 small huts on the island. And one of the rescuers looked at the man and said, "Hey, what are those buildings over there?" The man said, "Oh, the one on the right it's my home. It's where I live. It's where I sleep. And the one on the left, well, that's my church. That's where I worship." And the rescuer looked at him and said, "Well, but what's the one in the middle?" And he said, "Oh, that's the church I used to go to." Keeping it in. Keeping it in. Oh. You know, that story always makes me smile, but behind the humor is something very real. It's the fact that many of us, if we're honest, carry some sort of disappointment or disillusionment in our lives with the church or with God or with the way things are going. There's this former NBA player. He was an ESPN analyst, and he used to say all the time on his podcast, and I've actually held this for years. He says, happiness is a function of expectations. So if you have low expectations and they don't get met, then, well, there's that gap of happiness is not that bad. That disappointment is not that bad. And so it reminds me of the first road trip that I ever took. I was 16 years old. It was the first road trip that I would take apart from my parents. My friend at the time, my best friend, this is actually the same friend who was dating the girl in last week's story. And this is a true story, and so is that one. So a lot of issues with this friend. So his dad and he were going to drive to New York City. This was about 6 months after 9/11. So he wanted to go see the site. He had some family up there that he was going to stay with. And so for whatever reason, they invited me along. I mean, I was excited to go, ready to get out of the house. It was spring break. I'd seen New York on the movies and just thought, man, this is going to be great and exciting, and I can't wait. And so I agreed to go, but after I agreed, I thought about this trip a little more because we were going to be driving. And it was going to be a 17-hour road trip. And his dad had a pickup truck. And I thought, where am I going to sit? Where I can't ride in the back. I mean, I'm from the South, and we do that, but all the way up to New York, that's not going to work. So he had this partial extended cab in the back of the truck. So it wasn't the full, real seater where a human could sit back there. It was like where you throw the wrench or the groceries. But you had to lift the seat up and then crawl over and get back. And there was like a little bench that you sit in. And so I started regretting my choice. But I also thought, you know what? I'm going to be the only one back there. The son's going to be in the front seat. His dad's going to be driving. I can lay down. I got that whole bench to myself. And so you can imagine my shock and my disappointment when I showed up and I go to get in the back seat and all of their luggage was piled up all throughout the back to the top. I was like, hey, man, can we throw that stuff in the back? He was like, no, it's going to rain. I was like, yeah, but I might die. And so I get in the back of this cab, and they had so much luggage that I had to put my stuff in my lap. So I rode for 17 hours like this. And with every bump in the road, I regretted every decision that I had ever made. I could barely move. My knees were smashed. My legs were restless. My back was sore. That was a disappointing ride. It was a great trip. It was a terrible, terrible ride. I had this picture in my head that the journey was going to go a certain way, but reality didn't match it. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of us find ourselves with faith sometimes. I think a lot of us find that we have this expectation or this picture in our head, but then the reality doesn't match up. We had hopes, we had expectations, maybe we thought God was going to move a certain way, but then life got uncomfortable. It got confusing. It got disappointing. And that's where we meet these two disciples on the road to Emmaus. They're not just tired. They're not just walking, but they're carrying some unmet expectations about who they thought Jesus was supposed to be. So we're going to pick up the story in Luke 24:13. And this is, this is a couple of days after his death on the cross, and this is the day that Jesus has risen, right? There were rumors that he had risen, and so these disciples were leaving the day of his resurrection. And so that same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. And as they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" And they stopped short, sadness written across their faces. And one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days." What things? The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said. He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people, but our leading priests and other religious leaders, they handed him over to be condemned to death. They crucified him. And we had hoped that he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened about 3 days ago. So they explained to him that this Jesus, who they had been following for years, has now been killed. And they thought he was going to do something great. They thought he was going to rescue them, free them from their enemies, but instead he died at their hands. And so the road to Emmaus, it begins in confusion, in sorrow, and disillusionment. I mean, maybe you've been there. These disciples, they had followed Jesus. They had believed he was the Messiah. They saw the miracles. They saw his teachings, and they thought maybe he's going to overthrow Rome. So they weren't just walking to Emmaus. They were walking away from Jerusalem. They were walking away from the community of faith. They were walking away from hope. And we have so many examples in our lives, in our stories, the people we know, the friends we know, the people we see on TV who feel like the church or like God has let them down. Faith didn't get them the result that they wanted, and they became disillusioned and done with God. There's this New Testament scholar. His name's Bart Ehrman. He grew up Christian, but eventually he arrived at this conclusion that he could no longer call himself a Christian because of what he experienced in life. In fact, he says the very heart of the Christian claim that God loves his people, answers their prayers, and intervenes when they are in need, I came to think there was no such God, and decided that I had no choice but to abandon my faith and leave the Christian tradition. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar. He reads about the teachings of Jesus, about the life of Jesus. He has studied this, and then he looks at his life. He looks at the world, and he says, this God that the Bible talks about and that I've been taught about doesn't seem to match up with the life that I'm seeing. Disillusionment happens when our expectations of God don't match our experience of him. Bart Ehrman, he couldn't reconcile that an all-powerful and all-good God could be over a world with so much suffering and evil in it. So he decided to leave the faith. And maybe you've been disillusioned to some degree, maybe not to that degree, maybe to a smaller degree, but my question for you is, what is your response when your expectations of God don't match your experience with God? When God doesn't meet our expectations, when life leaves us disillusioned with church, with faith, with God, we often walk away like the disciples on the road to Emmaus. But I will say this, I think how we walk away from God, it looks different for each of us. I think sometimes there are those of us who have grown up Christian and it's what we know, and we go to church, and so we still attend and we come and we see that there is a net positive, but maybe life didn't turn out like you expected. So really you just disengaged from actually going all in with God. Or maybe you're somebody who comes and shows up and you do all the things in the church. You serve, you give, you go to small group, but Jesus, and he hasn't really transformed anything in your heart. Or maybe you carry bitterness toward God for an unhealed pain. Or maybe you're somebody who questions what you were raised to believe, and you're deconstructing that, and you're doing that alone because you're scared of the judgment that you may get from others. Scared to tell your family, scared to tell your friends. Or maybe you just settled for a manageable Jesus who won't disappoint you. I'm not going to expect too much of him as long as he doesn't expect too much of me. Because disappointment with God, it doesn't always lead to just flat out disbelief. But it does often lead to a distance from God. Sometimes it's a very strong departure, where not only do you no longer have faith, but you become actively hostile towards it. But sometimes it's just really strong skepticism where you're not hostile, but God is going to have to do something really big. He's going to have to do something undeniable to prove he's real. And sometimes we just don't even realize that we've stepped back. We just started praying less, hoping less, and expecting less. So the question here is, how does Jesus respond to his followers when they've walked away in disillusionment? That may be you. And the good news, though, is you're not alone in this. We see people who followed Jesus, who touched him, who heard him speak, and they still experience disillusionment. And so we got to ask the question, how does Jesus respond when we start to distance ourselves from him? When verse 15 through 19, it says, as they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. And he asked them, what are you discussing so intently? And then they tell him, and he says, tell me more. What things? Keep going. See, Jesus meets us on the road of disillusionment. He doesn't wait for us to turn around. He meets us right where we are. His disciples are walking away, and he's not in Jerusalem saying, y'all need to come back, figure it out. He goes to them. He doesn't scold them. He doesn't shame them. He doesn't say, well, I guess you never really believed. No, he shows up quietly, personally, on the road of disappointment with them. And the way he engages them is to listen to them. He doesn't correct them first. He invites them to share their disappointment with him. Imagine that. Jesus has just conquered death. He has risen from the grave, and the first people he pursues are not the most faithful. They're not the most hopeful, but they're the most disillusioned. What does that tell us about Jesus? What does that say to you? Here's the thing. Maybe you're not walking toward God right now, but that doesn't mean that Jesus isn't walking with you. He could be joining you in your journey without you recognizing that it's him at work. Whether it's an honest question that is stirring up something in you, and you're actively trying to figure it out. It's something that you're wrestling with. It says that as they walked, they were talking about these things. They were trying to make sense of it all. Or maybe it's this conversation that you can't shake. And you see others and how they're walking by faith, and you're inspired by them, and you say, man, I wish I had that. Or maybe it's a moment in your life that catches you off guard and it makes you wonder, could he still be near? Because even those who walk away, those who've been deeply disillusioned, often they find that they can't stop wrestling with Jesus. Because here's the thing, the questions don't disappear. If you reject God due to suffering, you still have to make sense of suffering. The ache doesn't go away just because you stop believing. So the hope lingers, the questions linger, and somewhere deep down there's still this longing that maybe, just maybe, Jesus really is who he says he is. Whether it's how you see it in other people, or the questions that you're still wrestling through, the things you're still trying to make sense of, or an experience that causes you to keep coming back and asking God to show up with you. You know, even Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar, he says a few things about Jesus where it makes me go, are you sure you've left the faith? And he says, no, people ask me this all the time. No, I have left the faith. But he says, it's foolish to say that Jesus didn't exist. Bart Ehrman says, we have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period. And then he says that all four Gospels present Jesus as divine. Now, this is something he rejected early on. And as he studied more, he was like, no, they really did believe he was God. I mean, the way he healed people, the way he accepted worship, cast out demons, raised the dead, he pronounced forgiveness. His followers believe that not only was he fully human, he was fully God. And then this is my favorite. In an interview They're talking to him about Jesus, and he says, here's the thing about Jesus' followers. If you're going to make up a Messiah, you wouldn't make up this one. The Messiah was supposed to overthrow enemies. So if you're going to make up a Messiah, you would make up a powerful Messiah. You wouldn't make up somebody who was humiliated and tortured and then killed by the very enemies you said that he was going to overthrow. Bart Ehrman, he sees it. He says he left the faith, but he doesn't say that Jesus is just a fairy tale. Here's the thing, the teachings of Jesus, the gospels that testify about the life of Jesus, somebody who studies this deeply and doesn't follow Jesus says, I mean, this stuff isn't just made up. So there's still this tension for him. And maybe that tension is there for us too, where we say, I at least hope it's right. It seems like my life is not matching up with what's promised here. Here's the thing, doubt and disillusionment, they don't disqualify you from meeting Jesus. In fact, doubt and disillusionment may be the very place that Jesus draws closest to you. Because the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's indifference. Faith and doubt are not enemies. They're often companions on the journey. Something we say here at Verve City all the time is faith and doubt make excellent dance partners. Your doubt raises the questions that need to be answered, and your faith gives you a hope and gives you answers that move you forward. And then your doubt raises another question that needs to be answered, and your faith gets strengthened as you look for this. And so next thing you know is your faith and your doubt are working together, moving you forward on your walk with Jesus. Jesus isn't threatened by your doubts. He's not threatened by your disappointments. He's not pacing heaven back and forth, wondering when you're going to figure it all out. No. The road to Emmaus shows us that he draws close right into your questions, right into your confusion, right into your sadness. He meets us with his presence before he meets us with answers. He dignifies our grief before confronting our beliefs. Because disillusionment and doubt are not the end of faith. They're an invitation to discover who Jesus really is. And one of the ways that we discover him is by learning from him. So after he's met with them, after he's listened to them, he says, you foolish people. Okay, hold on. I realize that I may have some explaining to do, because this sounds like it goes against literally everything I've just taught you. And if you have trust issues with God already, this isn't helping. Let me break this down. I did some study on this with some scholars, and let me summarize it. Essentially, the scholars say when Jesus is saying this, when Luke records this, he's not saying, you morons, can y'all not just get it? No, he's calling attention to the fact that they have walked with him, heard him teach this, and they just weren't grasping it. They were more obtuse than idiotic. Does that make sense? And so this is a literary device to say, hey, we've been teaching this, we've been talking about this. Okay, for those of you who have kids, you know that you have explained 1,100 times to your kids, here is how to do this thing. Here's how to take the trash out. Here's how to shut the car door. Here's how to eat cereal. And guess what? That bowl moves from the table into the sink if you move it. We've been there where we've tried to explain something, and it just seems so simple, But they're just not getting it. And here's the thing. He says, you find it so hard to believe. In other translations, it says you're slow of heart. He says you're not getting it up here because you're not actually accepting the teaching. So you're not a fool just because you're disillusioned. But you may not be getting it if you keep rejecting the teaching. Essentially, Jesus is saying, I've taught you this, and you don't get it, not because you're not smart, but because you don't want to accept it. He says, you find it so hard to believe all the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory? And Jesus took them through the writing of Moses, all the prophets, explaining the scriptures, the things concerning himself. Jesus begins to reframe what they know and what they believe about the Messiah. And here's what we need to be aware of. These are first century Jews. Their lives, their culture, their heritage is shaped completely by these writings of Moses in the Hebrew Bible. And everything in their life was preparing them to expect the Messiah who would save Israel. And so Jesus speaks directly into the core of their worldview. And they had these expectations of the Messiah. They believed he was going to be a military or a political leader who would liberate Israel from Rome. They believed that he was going to be a powerful, victorious king like David, and that their lives were immediately going to change. Now, here's the thing. These beliefs are not inherently bad, immoral, or even unrealistic with their experience with God. They've seen God do this before. They've seen God free them from Egypt. They've seen God send kings who were powerful. They've seen their nation flourish. But Jesus reframes everything that they view about the Messiah. Most likely, he's reinterpreting the scriptures for them. He says the Messiah must suffer before glory. He's most likely taking them through Isaiah 53, saying, by his wounds we are healed. There is a suffering servant here. Jesus reframes and says the Messiah's kingdom is spiritual and redemptive. While you're looking for your nation to flourish, I'm looking to save all of humanity. And he shows them all scriptures point to this suffering servant Messiah who's going to redeem mankind. From Moses through the prophets, he showed them how he is the thread that ties the whole story together. They had read scripture as a national story, but Jesus reframed it as a kingdom story. And he was the centerpiece. So Jesus redefined the Messiah for them. He didn't come to overthrow empires, but to overcome sin and death for the entire world. And if we're honest, we have some expectations of God today, centered around our culture, centered around our worldview. They probably look like this. God will protect me and keep my life stable. If I'm trying to live right, if I go to church, if I raise my kids well, God will keep things from falling apart. And in Southern California, where family and school performance and neighborhood safety are their top priorities for us, many of us believe that faith should guarantee stability and protection. But we become disillusioned when divorce happens, or when the diagnosis comes in, or when disappointment hits home. We often feel like God didn't hold up his end of the deal. God, you said to believe you and trust you, and I know that you have good things for me. So keep my life stable. And disillusionment comes in, doubt comes in when it seems like God's not keeping up with his end of the deal. Maybe you're somebody who sees God as somebody who's going to help you reach your goals. If I do my part, if I work hard, if I give, if I serve, God's going to open doors. I'm going to have success, career growth, financial breakthrough. And we're surrounded by people grinding, commuting long hours, juggling side hustles, trying to build a better life. But disillusionment hits when the promotion doesn't come, when the house falls through, or the plan unravels, and we wonder, why isn't God rewarding my effort? And honestly, this is probably mine more than anything. God should be obvious. If he is real, I shouldn't have to look for him. We live in a world that values certainty, that values proof, control, and many of us expect God to show up unmistakably through signs, through miracles, through answers that leave no doubt on our part. Especially here, we measure success by clarity and by results, and it feels unfair that God can feel hidden. You know, if God really cared, wouldn't he make himself unmistakably clear? But disillusionment comes in when God feels silent, he feels distant, or he feels hidden in pain or confusion or transition, and people start to assume maybe he's not real. Maybe he's real, but he doesn't care. Or maybe it's me. Maybe I'm just not worthy of hearing from him. But I have good news. Jesus reframes our expectations of God as well. Jesus shows us that our faith isn't a shield from suffering, but it's a pathway through it. He said, in this world, you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus says faith isn't insurance against pain. It's an invitation to walk with him through it, knowing that he's with us in the chaos. Jesus also says that God shapes us more than our success. He reminds his followers, seek the kingdom of God first, and everything you need will be added to you. Jesus reframes our understanding that God's greatest gift to us is not our progress towards our dream, it's purpose in his story. He's not just shaping circumstances, he's shaping us. Finally, God invites us to faith, not forced belief. Why doesn't God make himself obvious? Because he's after relationship, not just recognition. If God forced belief with overpowering displays, we'd never know if we actually loved him or if we just feared him. If God only spoke through spectacular moments, we'd never learn to walk with him in the ordinary ones. If faith didn't require trust, it wouldn't change us. Jesus, on the road to Emmaus, he didn't reveal himself right away because he was doing something deeper in their hearts. He was letting them process and ask questions. He wasn't shortcutting their journey of faith. He was walking them through the scriptures. He was guiding them to see with their hearts and not just their eyes. See, these expectations of God to make life comfortable, to give us success, and to make himself undeniably obvious, they're not unreasonable desires. They're not inherently immoral or bad or wrong. In fact, they often come from a real longing for purpose, for identity, and for clarity. But here's the thing. When we expect God to operate according to our framework and our expectations rather than his, we set ourselves up for disappointment. happiness is a function of expectations. So here's the thing. We discovered Jesus on our journey of faith and doubt, not forced belief. But here's the beautiful thing. Jesus doesn't just leave them in doubt. He doesn't just leave them in disappointment. He meets them in it, and he meets us in it. And just when it seems like the road is ending in conclusion, you think, all right, he taught them all they need to know. This is really all they need in order to live the right life. We just got to have enough information. We just have to have enough that we know and understand. Jesus does something that changes everything. By the time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey, Jesus acted as if he were going on, but they begged him, stay the night with us since it's getting late. So he went home with them, and as they sat down to eat, he took the bread and he blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment he disappeared. They had seen Jesus do this before when he fed the 5,000. They had heard that he had broke the bread and blessed it with the disciples at the Last Supper. And so after this long walk, after this honest conversation, after the scripture lesson, Jesus does something simple and intimate. He just breaks bread with them. And in that moment, their eyes are open. They recognize him. And this happened when they invited him to stay. He reveals himself, and everything changed. Jesus didn't force his way in. He waited for their invitation. Then he revealed his identity when they slowed down, they sat with him, and they shared the table. Jesus didn't reject their expectations, he reframed them. He showed them that God's story was bigger, deeper, and more beautiful than they could imagine. And their disappointment with God caused them to walk away from faith. But as they spent time being with Jesus and learning from Jesus, they found a new connection and a new understanding of who God is and what he was doing. Disciples spend time with Jesus and they learn from him to understand who God is and what he is doing, to reframe their expectations. And so maybe you've been walking away, maybe you're disappointed, maybe you're confused, or maybe you're just drifting. Maybe your faith has been more of a memory than a relationship and experience. But Jesus hasn't left you. He's been walking with you the whole way. And today, he's inviting you to walk with him again. And as a church, we want to help you walk with Jesus again, but it takes intentionality on your part. Whether you're exploring faith and you need a place like Alpha where you can go and ask questions and wrestle with the hard things, or whether you're new and you're looking for growth and you're looking for community and you need to sign up for Rooted that's coming up in 6 weeks, or maybe you're somebody who's just on a healing journey and you need a care group because right now you need care. We want to help you find life by following Jesus here. Because following Jesus can open your eyes to something deeper, something fuller, and something more alive. They expected rescue from Rome, but Jesus brought redemption for the whole world. Because here's the thing, sometimes God doesn't change our story to what we wanted. He invites us into a better one. They said to each other, didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us? He said, there's something that stirred in our hearts as we heard Jesus tell us about the Messiah, to tell us about the hope that God is going to bring. And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. They had heard Jesus may have resurrected, but they just weren't sure. When they realized that Jesus was raised from the dead, when they recognized him, and they realized that God did something even they couldn't expect. Jesus didn't meet their expectations. He exceeded them with resurrection power. And that power, it didn't just raise him from the dead, it raised them to a new life. They go from walking away in sorrow to running back with joy, from disappointment to mission, from hopelessness to a fire in their bones, because Jesus doesn't just reframe our story and our expectations, he rewrites your future. Their story changed because Jesus met them, he spoke to them and stayed with them, and he can do the same for you. Because even when we've lost our way, Jesus hasn't lost sight of us. And so today we're going to sing together this final song. And my prayer for you is to make it more than music, to let it be your moment of return, to let it be the day that you come back home, that you say to Jesus, I'm ready to walk with you again. I want to invite you in. Let's stand and praise God together because he has not lost sight of us.